To check the step-up rods and pistons, remove the step-up piston cover plates very carefully. Hold the cover plate with your finger to keep the piston and rods from flying out. They're spring-loaded. Here's what happens if a piston sticks. If the piston gets stuck at the top of the cylinder, you'll have poor economy and high emissions before the secondaries are opened. When the piston is stuck at the bottom, you'll get a lean mixture and poor performance during acceleration.
What causes the pistons to stick, Don?
Same old problem, Tom, dirt. Clean the piston, spring, and metering rod thoroughly with carburetor solvent, and if necessary, polish the piston with crocus cloth.
Don't use anything but crocus cloth. And be careful not to remove any metal or round the lands on the piston. Go ahead, Don.
Good point, Tech. The Carter AVS carburetor used on cars with air conditioning has a hot idle compensator valve on the secondary section between the bores. This valve leans out the rich mixtures which result from high underhood temperatures. Here's how it works. At normal temperatures, the compensator valve is held closed by a bimetallic spring. When underhood temperatures climb, the valve opens an air passage directly to the intake manifold to relieve an over-rich condition as a result of fuel vapors.
And don't tinker with a compensator valve or you will upset the calibration. Anything else before we get to the Holly?
A few things, Tech. One of them is idle mixture and speed adjustments. They go hand in hand. The objective is to arrive at the correct idle speed, correct air-fuel ratio, and correct balance between the two idle systems for acceptable idle operation. The usual idle mixture and speed adjusting precautions apply. The engine must be warmed up, ignition timing correct, use an accurate tachometer, and connect an exhaust analyzer to check air-fuel ratio. I won't go into details on idle speed and mixture adjustment. Follow the service manual carefully and you won't have any problems. However, there are a couple of precautions I'd like to point out. Adjust both mixture screws 1/16 at a time until the air-fuel ratio is within specifications. And remember, always adjust from rich to lean. The reference book will give you a detailed procedure. If everything else is okay, you've probably got an imbalance between the two primary bores. If you have one of these new carbs, you'll have to remove the plastic limiting tabs and reset the idle mixture screws.
On early production carburetors, the two limiter screws at the base have to be unplugged and reset. The procedure for resetting either model is in the reference book.
That wraps up the AVS 4-barrel, Tom. Now let's take a close look at the Holly 4-barrel carburetor. I think we can find some pretty important things to review. The vacuum kick unit may look slightly different, but works the same as the AVS kick unit. Any adjustments are also made at the loop in the vacuum kick link. The specs are not the same, so check your service manual when setting the vacuum kick. Two things are pretty important when setting the vacuum kick. First, make sure the modulating spring is fully compressed, and be careful not to twist the diaphragm when you change the link opening. It doesn't take much to twist the diaphragm, and be careful not to bend the bracket either.
I just noticed that there isn't any fast idle speed adjusting screw on this Holly.
That's right, Tom. The fast idle adjusting tang does two jobs, sets the fast idle speed and affects the fast idle cam position. Let's do the fast idle speed adjustment first.
Whoa, Don. Before we go any further, I think there's a point here that should be brought up and clarified. I'm sure you know that you have to qualify the choke control lever. Why don't you tell Tom how it's done, Don?
All you want to do is make sure that the choke control lever hole is the proper distance above the carburetor base with the choke closed. Adjusting the loop at the upper end of the choke shaft rod gives you the correct measurement. And remember, the choke lever must be qualified before making vacuum kick, cam position, or choke unloader adjustments. To check fast idle speed, first make sure the engine is warmed up. Then position the fast idle tang on the second highest step of the fast idle cam and check engine speed. To adjust fast idle speed, insert a screwdriver in the fast idle tang slot. Turn to the right to increase and to the left to reduce fast idle speed. Hold the cam in position and flash the throttle. The engine should level out at proper RPM.
And watch that adjustment. The tang affects both fast idle speed and cam position. So when you adjust the fast idle speed, always double-check the fast idle cam position.
Next, we have to adjust the fast idle cam position to assure proper speeds at each step of the fast idle cam during warm-up. To check cam position, place the fast idle tang on second highest speed step. Then, lift the choke control lever lightly to close the choke. Insert the specified drill or gauge in the choke valve opening. You should feel a slight drag when removing the drill. To adjust the fast idle cam position, bend the cam position adjusting tang until you have the correct choke valve opening. There is one other thing you should watch for when making the fast idle speed adjustment. Make sure the fast idle tang does not rub against the back of the cam. Let's go on to the choke unloader. To check the choke unloader adjustment, move the throttle valves wide open and hold the choke valve closed with light pressure on the choke control lever. Use the proper size drill listed in the service manual to check the amount the choke valve opens. To widen the choke opening, bend the choke unloader tang toward the pin on the fast idle cam. If you have to narrow the opening, bend the tang the other way.
And don't forget, when you make these adjustments, always be sure that the drill is resting flush against the air horn wall. Otherwise, the adjustment can be off. It's your show again, Don.
Okay, Tech. Now for the accelerator pump adjustment. It's quite a bit different from the AVS pump and is adjusted with the primary throttle valves wide open. So, hold the throttle valves wide open and move the pump diaphragm lever down as far as it'll go. Check the clearance between the diaphragm lever and the adjusting screw. To adjust the clearance, turn the screw in or out. When the pump is set, the bowl vent valve is the next adjustment. On this carburetor, you check the valve opening when the primary throttle is at curb idle position. Bend the curved part of the operating rod to adjust the valve.
And watch when making the adjustment to be sure the transfer tube doesn't interfere with the bowl vent rod.
Hey, Don, what are the two holes in the throttle bell crank for?
They position the accelerator pump cam. The cam screw should be in the upper or number 1 hole when you adjust pump lever clearance for normal operating conditions. Use the second hole for high temperature operation. And that brings us to the secondary section. This diaphragm unit opens the secondary throttle valves when airflow through the venturis creates enough vacuum to overcome the diaphragm spring. No adjustment is needed here, but if the diaphragm is replaced for any reason, make sure the replacement spring color is the same as the original. This late production Holley carburetor has an idle mixture adjusting screw in each side of the primary metering block. You'll have to check the service manual for the specs, but the procedures and precautions are generally the same as for the AVS model. If you have to reset the idle mixture screws for proper balance, remove the plastic stop tabs.
I'm sure most of you know, but if you have to reset the limiter screws on an early production Holley, they're under the plugs on each side of the primary metering block. On the early production models, the idle mixture adjusting screw is in the air horn. This means you'll have to adjust the idle mixture with the air cleaner removed and then recheck the idle mixture and speed after installing the air cleaner. Care to add anything, Don?
One thing, Tech. If you remove the choke control lever or the accelerator pump lever, be sure to crimp the spring retainer clip when you put it back on. If it spreads, it can fall off. That about wraps it up, Tech.
Before we go, if you technicians have made all the external adjustments and you still have problems, there's a few things you'd better check. Make sure that both the primary and secondary fuel bowl screws are properly tightened. Incidentally, when installing the fuel bowl screws, make sure you use the new screw seals included in the kit. The screw seal should be installed on the screws. If you put them in the bowl cavity and thread the screws through them, you'll get bits of the seal in the fuel bowl, which may cause future problems. If you run across a carburetor with an obsolete power valve, replace it with a new type. Always use a new gasket and tighten the valve to the correct torque. You'll find the torque rating in the reference book. Another thing you want to watch out for is the primary metering body gasket. Make sure it's the right one. The location of the passage holes is different, and if you use the 68 gasket on a 67 model, the projection prevents sealing. It's also very important to tighten the secondary metering block screws and throttle body screws to the correct torque. Check the reference book for this one too. Float level specifications were revised after the service manual went to press, so be sure and check your service bulletins for the latest float level information. And on the subject of float level, if you have a wet gauge, be sure and use it to check float level after the carburetor is all buttoned up and installed on the car. And before we button this session up, I want to point out that this month's reference book has a lot of additional, up-to-the-minute information on Holley 4 barrels that should come in mighty handy. See you all at our next meeting.